Welcome along to another Data Training Academy webinar. My name is Robert Crane. So in this webinar, what we're going to basically have a look at is the Office 365 identities. But remember that the webinar has now started recording. If you do have questions, please send them to microsoft.sales@dicadata.com.au. So our weekly webinars continue on Wednesdays from 11 to 11:45. We'll be looking at the identities of Office 365, as I mentioned. Next week we'll be looking at doing some basic administrating of SharePoint Online. In the 14th we'll dive into Delve and the Office groups, and then on the 21st we'll have a look at some troubleshooting tips and tricks. So our agenda for today is to look at basically the three different models of identity that Office 365 provides. So we have cloud identities, synchronized identities, and federated identities. We'll finish off with some best practices and takeaways, as we always do. Now let's kick off the ball here and get started with our Office 365 identities. Now if you've been on any of the previous webinars, you probably will have seen this slide where we're talking about the comparison between the different offerings. So to start off with, we have what's known as the online or the cloud identities. So these are typically aimed at smaller organizations who don't have a local AD, don't have on-premise equipment typically. Again, the advantage is they don't need an additional server, but the downside is they don't get things like single sign-on. They don't get third-party two-factor authentication. They will get two-factor authentication if they select to configure it from Office 365. And typically the biggest pain point is around having two sets of credentials to manage with different passwords. So they would have a LAN password and they would have an Office 365 password, which are different and are not synchronized. Okay. The important thing to remember with this model is that all the identities for Office 365 are mastered in the cloud, which means that they are created, they are deleted, they are updated, they are changed, they are managed completely from the cloud using the admin portal. Now, the next option that we've got here is the online identities combined with the AAD Sync or the Azure AD Connect. So what this does is take a copy, so it's a one-way copy to the cloud, to Office 365 of the users in a local on-premise AD, and that gives you the ability obviously to manage a larger set of users. It also allows you to move organizations who already have investment in on-site infrastructure, but the thing you need to remember here is that when you do this, that the users and the groups, importantly, are all mastered on-premise. So that means if you create a new user, you have to do it in your local AD. When you do that, that is then synchronized to the cloud. You have to assign a license and go from there. There's no major assignment. Password resets are all, again, handled all on premise. The downside is, again, we still don't get full single sign-on. There's no third-party two-factor authentication supported, and generally there are two sets of credentials unless we're using the most recent connection synchronization tool. The third and final, so the online identities basically uses Microsoft Azure AD. So the login, when the user logs in, they log into Azure AD, which then gives them rights and assignments to the Office 365 services. The middle option here combines the Azure AD and the Windows Server AD. So the local AD is copied, one-way copy, up to Azure AD to make sure they're the same. So the benefit is if the local server is not available or the synchronization client is not running, then users will still be able to log into Office 365 to get the services because a copy of those credentials have been provided to Azure AD. The third and final option here is what's known as federated identities. So these are typically aimed at larger organizations because they require additional on-premise servers. So we'll cover this in detail, but important thing to remember is you require additional servers, and best practice generally dictates that you should be looking to deploy these in high availability. So you need to have them load balanced and replicated a number of ways. But if you go down the federated ID, then you get single sign-on because you're signing into your local AD. Everything, again, is still mastered on-premise. So, again, user passwords, user creation is all done through your local AD. The password policies and whatnot are controlled locally. This allows things like third-party two-factor authentication. Okay, this is typically a scenario you need to go down if you're looking at something like hybrid Exchange. So if you want to maintain a Exchange server on-premise but use some of the features of Exchange online, then you would basically need to look at the hybrid identity. Now, note that the hybrid identity also still requires the DSync functionality. So our online identities, okay, so these are our cloud-based identities, pretty straightforward here. Basically, the user logs into portal.office.com and then they are then given access to the Office 365 services. In essence, their identity, okay, so that little tag there is then managed all in the cloud, everything on the cloud, nothing on premise at all. Okay, so the administrator simply works through the portal to add users, delete users, change passwords, and do whatever. No need for on-premise equipment. Typically, the way that we do that is we go into the Office 365 admin, we go into the Office 365 admin center, and then we go into the active users area. So here we can see the active users. We will create new users, edit users, change their passwords. And you'll notice in the status column there that it designates where they are located. So their identity is currently located in cloud. All right, so they're all Office 365 users. Now, when you need to go and change some of the more detailed parameters, you can go in and edit the parameters for each individual user. Simply drill into that user specifically, and as you'll see under additional details, you can add things like their job title, department, office, some pretty typical AD fields. Now, when we go to the next model, some of that information obviously will be synchronized from the on-premise server into Office 365. But in the cloud model identity, you'll see that we've got full control over all the fields. We can update them and use them directly without any additional management on-premise that's required. So that's pretty straightforward. I think everybody's pretty comfortable with that sort of environment. Where it starts getting a little bit, I suppose, a little bit more complicated is when we move to the next model, which is synchronized identity. So the way synchronized identity works is on the left we can see that our cloud identity basically sits on its own. There's no zero on-premise service required, as we talked about. The middle model is the synchronized identity here. So what we have is an on-premise Active Directory. It then runs a synchronization program that will synchronize not only the user's identity, so their username, their passwords, their attributes. It will also synchronize now their passwords. So we'll cover what tools do that, but using the latest tool you will get the ability to synchronize passwords up to Office 365. So your on-premise users log into their AD will be the same as their Office 365 logins. Now, you will notice with the direction of the arrows there that it is a one-way sync. So we are syncing from our local AD up to Office 365. Office 365 simply has a copy of the user's identity credentials. Okay, so again, if the if the synchronization server isn't available or the internet's down on the site that our main AD is, users can still log in elsewhere to Office 365 because a copy of their credentials is in the cloud. The third option on the right is our federated identities. Now you'll notice that the arrows move two ways from our on-premise directory. So what that means is we still need the directory synchronization to copy the user objects, but when it comes to actually authenticating, the authentication is then passed back to our local AD. So what that means is Office 365 doesn't effectively do the logins anymore. What it does is it passes a security token or requests a security token from the on-premise AD to verify that the user has a valid login to the directory it trusts, and then it will give it access to the Office 365 services. Now, if you go down the synchronized model, best practice is that you will need additional on-premise equipment. So typically, you can now run the directory synchronization program Azure AD Connect on a domain controller, which most people will have in place anyway, but best practice is always to generally install that on a separate member server. Now, when we move to our federated identities, this is where we do certainly need need additional equipment. We're going to need dedicated ADFS servers, and typically these need to be installed in load balanced configuration. And we'll also need ADFS proxies, and we'll cover the reasons for that. So there are a number of additional on-premise equipment that you'll need to configure and set up. Generally, it's not supported putting ADFS on a domain controller, and you can't generally install an ADFS proxy on an ADFS box. So they do need to be separate items. Okay, so the way the synchronization started out with initially was using a program called DirSync. So when DirSync ran, it basically synchronized the users, groups, and contacts from the local AD to Windows Azure AD. Downside was it didn't do any password synchronization. So if you're running the synchronization environment now and you're still using DirSync, the downside is you potentially going to have different passwords from on-premise in the cloud because it's not copying those up from your local environment. Now the good news is that DirSync program has been deprecated. It has been replaced with a newer tool. The newer tool, next step up, is called Azure AD Sync. This adds a whole lot of benefits and features, but one of the big benefits, basically apart from synchronizing groups and contacts, was that it would also synchronize the password hashes. So what it would take is a cryptographic hash of the password locally and then add some more security around it, push that up into Office 365. So now the passwords would be identical between your local AD and Office 365. So that was a big step forward. So if you aren't using DirSync, then you certainly, if you are using DirSync, then you need to look to upgrade to at least Azure AD Sync. Now, as you can see there, Azure AD Sync has also recently been deprecated in favor of a new tool. The latest tool is called Azure AD Connect. So Azure AD Connect has all the features of DirSync and Azure AD Sync, but includes a number of additional features. So what we can do now is we can use Azure AD Connect to connect our Windows directory, but also third-party directories that may be out there. So LDAP, a whole lot of third-party on-premise directories are now supported via this Azure AD Connect to be synchronized to Azure AD. And then you'll see that synchronization can give them access to things like Dynamics, Office 365, Windows Intune, plus some non-cloud-based applications through the Azure AD single sign-on portal, which we have covered here briefly. So what you could do is set up a connection, for example, to Twitter, Facebook, Xero, MYOB Online with an Office 365 login. The user could then have a login locally that's synchronized up to the cloud. Excuse me. Sorry about that. And then that same identity could be used to automatically log them in to Xero, MYOB, and those cloud-based applications as well. What we also see with Azure AD is the ability to connect to and manage mobile PCs and mobile devices, especially the case around Windows 10, because Windows 10 now supports the direct Azure AD Connect. So our synchronized model contains basically an identity on our local on-premise directory on the right-hand side there. You'll see that using Azure AD Sync or Connect, it is then copied up to Office 365. So the identity in Office 365 is actually a copy of what is on-premise. And the passwords, as you see with the dotted line, are taken via a password hash. So they are securely uploaded to Office 365. When a user logs in, they still log into Office 365 directly, and they use the copied version, the copy of the identity taken from the local AD to log in and access Office 365. So the great thing here is that you get a certain amount of redundancy, because if the link does fail or the syncing stops for some reason, users still have a copy of their identity in the cloud and they can access the services as they need. Important to note, but there is only out of the box with the standard Office 365 and the standard Azure AD Connect or Sync, there's only one way synchronization of that information. So it travels from the on-premise directory up to Office 365. Any changes in Office 365 that are made are overwritten during the next synchronization process from the local AD. So before you run out and start installing Azure AD Connect, a couple of things to keep in mind. You probably need to sit down and run the Microsoft tool to test your environment, your AD environment, which is IDFix. Then you need to verify that your DNS is all set up. You have a custom domain set up that matches your users, and you'll need to obviously make sure that the UPN of your users on-premise matches the users that are going to be in the cloud if they already exist. So if you have users already in Office 365 and they're using a .onmicrosoft.com account, you'll need to make sure they have a custom domain which matches the UPN, the primary UPN of the local LAN. Don't forget, if you've got some other directories besides Active Directory, you need to make sure that they're all set up and configured correctly as well. And if you need Azure AD Connect now, running it on a domain controller is supported. Generally not best practice, but in a smaller environment you can certainly do that. Remember that when you install Azure AD Connect or Azure AD Sync, it actually installs potentially a version of SQL on the server, so that's why it's generally not a good idea to put it on a domain controller. That version is just basically SQL Express for managing the objects, and SQL Express, as you're probably aware, is good up to a certain limit, which is around 100,000 directory objects, which is probably more than most small environments would ever come across. Now, if you want, you can also take the step and install Azure AD Connect on a box in Azure with IaaS. So you can offload that need to put on a domain controller by using Azure IaaS. If you currently have DirSync or Microsoft Forefront Identity Manager, you can upgrade directly using AD Connect. So Azure AD Connect can be installed or upgraded, can upgrade those products directly over the top. And your forest level needs to be Windows Server 2003 or better. That should be most boxes, I would think, on the environment these days. Now, when you install IDFix, basically what it's going to do is it's going to go through and it's going to check for you any issues that could prevent synchronization. So it's going to check things like object issues that may be orphaned or corrupted. It's also going to make sure that it can do LDAP queries throughout your directory, and it's also going to potentially provide you a list that you can export your list of users to a CSV. So maybe you want to do a bulk upload via spreadsheet rather than doing the sync at some stage. And the important thing is that you'll see that on the right hand side you can take action to have the tool automatically resolve any of the issues that it finds. Good thing about the IDFix is that once you implement that, you can generally roll it back quite quickly and easily. So it has the ability to roll forward and roll backwards. So it's always a very good tool to check the status, the health of the local AD. So certainly recommend you go in and run that tool and have a look at it no matter what you're doing in your environment. And again, you get all the reports, and the critical issues are the ones you obviously need to pay attention to. So what is IDFix? So it's going to remove things like duplicate proxy addresses. It's going to make sure your UPN is correct. It's going to prompt you if you've got the use of a non-routable domain. So if you've got an SBS environment that's been using .local and the .local is the user's primary UPN, well, it's going to warn you about that. You're going to need to make changes to do that. So again, it's going to check attributes like the user principal name to achieve that. So again, a great tool to run to make sure your AD's in good health, good shape for a synchronization. Now, we'll run through here a quick screenshots of the actual installation of Azure AD Connect. So when you install the product, a free download, it will install SQL Express by default. Right, a local DB. It will install the synchronization engine, the single sign-in assistant, the Office 365 single sign-in assistant, and then the Azure AD connector. Now, if you do the Express settings, it's going to basically install most of that with a local service account and use a random password. But generally, if you want to go through, you certainly can customize it. You can select that option, and once we do that, we can now go in and specify the account in the domain, whether we want to use an SQL server elsewhere in an environment, and things like setting the encryption keys, and there is also now a wizard to be able to set up the federation or the federated IDs with ADFS. So if we've gone down the custom route, what we need to do here, you'll see here there is an option to set up with the wizard federation with ADFS again, so make sure that you have those items in place before you attempt using that wizard, but most times what we're going to select here is the password synchronization. We then need to give it the credentials to log into our Azure AD, so this would be a global administrator login to our Office 365, so that can connect to the tenant. We then need to connect to our local AD. Okay, so we're going to need a domain user, typically an enterprise admin. We put those details in, and you'll see there up the top we get the ability to select the directory type, in this case just an Active Directory, but if you've got third-party options you can pull that down and select from different directories you may have on premise. Once you put that in, you add that domain, and you'll see now you can add multiple forests and multiple directories into here, and then simply continue on for the next option here. Now, we may already have users in Office 365 and they may be different or maybe the same as users currently in your AD. Now, you may want to make sure that they match. So if you have Fred Jones on premise, you want to make sure that Fred matches Fred Jones in Office 365. Typically, the way this happens out of the box is using the user principal name. So the UPN needs to match. So, for example, fred.jones@domain.com has to be fred.jones@domain.com in Office 365. If they are the same via UPN, then Office 365 and the synchronization tool will match those users and merge them together. If Office 365 can't synchronize those users correctly because the UPNs don't match, you will end up with a fred.jones@tenantname.onmicrosoft.com. So you'll end up with duplicate users. So make sure you run the ID fix tool to ensure that your UPNs are identical. If you want to go in here and customize it, you can tell it, well, maybe I'm not using the UPN, maybe I can use a user login or a mail attribute or some other way of matching the users. But if you do want to match them, make sure generally that the UPN is identical between the users on premise and in Office 365. Now, Azure AD also gives us the Azure AD Connect also gives us the ability to synchronize a subset of our users. Typically, you want to do them all, but let's say you've got a large AD perhaps, or you just want to set this up as a test environment. You can certainly synchronize just a selected group of users. So typically, Microsoft lets you know that this is for piloting prior to running out a full installation. But typically, you're going to select all users to do this. And you'll see here that we now have a number of additional optional features. So if you want to do Exchange, if you're doing Exchange Hybrid, then you'll want to have the hybrid write-back attribute, so it can write back some of the attributes from Office 365 to on-premise Exchange servers. You'll notice that there is an option for a password write-back, but that is an Azure AD Premium feature. So if you do opt to go down the Azure AD Premium and add that into an existing Office 365 subscription, then potentially you can get a password write-back, so to a password sync, but you'll need, like I said, Azure AD Premium. And if you want, you can go in there and limit which attributes are taken from your local AD up to Azure AD. So we can also go in here and determine what apps are going to be used when we come to Azure AD. Generally, you leave those all selected. You don't want to go in and restrict the applications that your on-premise users can get to once the synchronization process has commenced. But Azure AD Connect gives you that option if you so choose. Again, you can go in and customize this more if you want to do that. So once that's all done, we're ready to configure. We see that the synchronization process button is selected by default. And then if we do the install, it's going to basically run through and install a number of components and then commence the synchronization process automatically. So be aware that once the synchronization process starts, if you've typically selected that, then what's going to happen is it's going to basically start synchronizing all the objects and do that directly at Office 365. So you've got a lot of objects. It's going to take a little while and potentially consume some of your bandwidth to do that. Now, once we've got the sync, it's pretty straightforward. It's just basically next, 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 and the synchronization should commence if you've done everything beforehand. You can go in and check the installation logs, which you find in a temp directory under AAD Sync. You should also know that you can go in and modify the synchronization rules if you want. So maybe you've got different rules if you have Exchange and Skype for Business on-premise already in the AD, different versions of Exchange. Maybe you're doing a hybrid environment. And again, you can go in and customize those synchronization rules if you want, but generally you don't need to do that. And to do that, there is a sync editor tool that you can use to go in and modify exactly what's synchronized, but again, much more of an advanced option. Now, typically, once the synchronization process is running, you will find in your programs that have been added to your local AD, your local server, sync server, and one of those is the synchronization service. So if we go to the synchronization service, this provides you basically the Microsoft Forefront Identity Manager, and you can go in there and you can see each synchronization taking place. Okay, so we can drill into each item there. You'll see it's hyperlinked. We can go in and look at what items were synced, what attributes were changed. So if you change something on premise, you can see whether that has been synchronized through. So this will give you a report on the whole synchronization process. Now, generally remember that out of the box that the synchronization of passwords happens every 2 minutes, and the synchronization of user objects happens every 3 hours on a regular schedule. This is done via the Windows tasks, which you can adjust if you want, and you can also go in and run this manually. So there's a command line that you can go in and force the synchronization to happen immediately. But the tool that you want to use to go in and view the synchronization progress is the synchronization service there, which you'll find in your normal programs. Now, once you've done that, remember that we do have some limits here. So new tenants are able to synchronize 50,000 directory objects. Again, if you have a vanity domain already in there or a custom domain, you go up to 300,000, which is pretty much what you need to do anyway. The guidance Microsoft gives is around an hour per 5,000 objects. So for every 5,000 objects, you need to allow about an hour to fully synchronize that up to Office 365. Remember, if you have a password expiry set for your local environment, that may mean that the password for the sync account expires and the synchronization no longer takes place, which is not a good thing. So make sure that you either disable that or make sure that you know when it needs to be changed. Once you've synchronized your users, be aware that they are not automatically assigned a license in Office 365 because you may have multiple subscriptions that a user may or may not take advantage of. So it's still up to you as an administrator, once the users have synchronized, to go into your portal or use PowerShell to automatically configure, to go in and assign the appropriate licenses to the appropriate users. So they'll be synchronized, but they won't get access to the Office 365 services until you give them a license. Remember that the good thing about Azure AD Connect is its high availability, which means if there is a problem, you can uninstall it, reinstall it, put it on another server, put it in another location. It's a pretty robust tool, again, because it's a one-way copy. It's not particularly sophisticated, which means it has a high degree of resilience. And if you want, you can elect to filter certain attribute or certain areas of your AD, and you may put all the users who you want to be cloud users in a certain OU, and you can use the Azure AD Connect tool to only synchronize users from that OU. So maybe you've got your service accounts or maybe on-premise equipment that uses different accounts that you don't want synchronized. You put them in a different OU and then tell Azure AD exactly what you want to synchronize by domain or OU, but you can also do it by the attributes of the login if you want. So it's a fair amount of flexibility if you want to keep it as clean and tidy as possible. Now, when we talk about password hash, Azure AD Connect and Azure AD Sync will take a hash of the password locally, then they will add additional security around that and then send that up to Azure AD via the synchronization process. So remember, it's not actually sending the passwords, it's sending a non-reversible hash of that password, which Office 365 can compute to allow users to access and log into their system, right? So again, remember that it enables Azure AD users to validate their passwords when they log in. So if a user logs into their on-premise equipment using a password that is then hashed, taken to Office 365. If the user then accesses Office 365 from Starbucks or outside the organization by logging into the portal, that password will be the same. So with that, let's talk about the final option here, which is federated identities. So federated identities bring a number of additional complexities here. What we see is we need to again have the Azure AD Connect in place, which we've talked about, to synchronize the user objects from the local AD. The identity is still on the on-premise directory, but we now add the ability to have Office 365 trust the local network. The way it trusts the local network is by using the federation services, so the ADFS. So what that means is you need to install and configure an ADFS environment, connect that to your on-premise AD, then set up a trust basically between your on-premise ADFS and Office 365. Once that's established, Office 365 no longer handles the authentication. What happens now is a user asks for an Office 365 service. Office 365 will say, well, we don't look after we don't authenticate this. I need to pass that off to the local AD to authenticate the user. It passes that off via ADFS. The local AD verifies that identity, says that it's valid, passes a security token back through the ADFS service to Office 365, which then grants users access to the Office 365 service. So the important thing here to note is that identity is no longer cloud-based. Identity here in the federated model is totally on-premise, is totally dependent on the local AD, okay, and still requires Azure AD Connect to copy up the user objects. Now, obviously, that's creating a single point of failure, because if our ADFS server fails, then Office 365 can't talk to the local AD, can't authenticate a user, and can't give them access to Office 365 services. So we can use the Azure AD Connect and Sync as a backup, so it will synchronize the password. So if our ADFS environment fails, we can still use the synchronization passwords. But remember, if for some reason that the ADFS and the synchronization software isn't available to Office 365, then basically what's going to happen is users will not be able to log in to any of the Office 365 services. So this is why redundancy and high availability is so important in a federated environment. So what we mean by this is the typical best practice environment is you have your local AD, then you would have basically your federated proxies. Okay, so you would have two ADFS servers in load balance mode, and then you also need to have two ADFS proxy servers to handle your external users. So your ADFS servers provide the authentication for your internal users inside the network, and to allow users who are outside your network, you will have to set up two ADFS proxies. The ADFS proxy talks to the ADFS server, which talks to the AD and authenticates the user who is outside the LAN. So best practice again is to ensure that the ADFS proxies are separated from the local network using a firewall in a DMZ, and that is then properly segregated from the internet. Now remember, when users need to get to Office 365, they will go to Office 365 services. It will then pass that token back through the ADFS proxy servers and through the ADFS server to the Active Directory and verify that. So if you have external users, you're going to need two ADFS servers load balanced. You're going to need two ADFS proxies load balanced to allow external users to access the network. So in essence, this is how it works. If you want to access Exchange Online users from inside the network, query Exchange Online. Exchange Online will verify it doesn't look after identity. It will pass that identity authentication request back to the ADFS proxy, which will then verify those credentials within the local AD. Then the user can get access to their Outlook. So again, bringing the federated identity, using the federated identity model means bringing the identity management basically back on premise. It means bringing it back into your environment, and that requires additional equipment plus typically third-party certificates as well. Okay, so ADFS and single sign-on. So once you set up ADFS, it will give you single sign-on. So the user is signing into their local identity. That is then pushed across directly into Office 365 because, again, it's got the same login credentials, the same identity server is local, but it is a little bit more complex than the synchronized identity. So make sure that you have read all the guidance and have a look at implementing it correctly, and you'll have to make sure that you have the best practice around firewalls and permissions for those servers in DMZs. Now, you can change between the identity models as you need, so you can go from your cloud identity to synchronized, you can go from synchronized to federated. Again, there the steps are typically synchronized to federated means deploying ADFS, setting up that environment. If you want, you can then move backwards, federated identity back to synchronized identity and synchronized back to cloud identity. Typically, you need PowerShell commands to achieve that, and there'll be a bit of a time delay while that process is completed. So remember that there is the flexibility to move between the different identity models if you want, but typically you would migrate from cloud to synchronized, then synchronized to federated, and that's where you would end up. So generally have a good think about that before you go down that path. Now, unsurprisingly, Microsoft's recommendation for identity management is to pick the simplest one for your needs. Okay, so typically most people probably just need the cloud, and when they don't have on-premise AD, when they don't need to do any on-premise restructuring, and maybe if they're just doing a pilot. Now, if you want to go synchronized, you're going to get the password hash, which means you're going to have the same password on-premise as you have in the cloud. So it's going to give you what's known as same sign-on. It's not single sign-on, it's same sign-on. Okay, so again, that's going to make life a lot easier for most users. And you can use the credentials that then they are saved in the Windows Credential Manager. But remember that no matter what identity model you use, Outlook currently does not support the full single sign-on. So the users may still be prompted, even if they go to federated identity to log into Office 365. The basic guidance I would give you, and I think Microsoft would as well, is basically the password hash. So you want to use Azure AD Connect and turn on the password synchronization. That's going to cover most bases. You really need to have a good reason, I think, to move towards doing federated identities for the simple fact that it's more complex and requires more investment on premise. But if you want, there are third-party options. Apart from ADFS, there are third-party options. There's Shibboleth and also SAML options, and you can have third-party providers as well. So there's a number of third-party providers out there. People like Okta as well can provide login with it rather than going down the federated identity if you want to do that. So third-party options are available. Obviously, they're an additional cost to the existing Office 365 environment. So our best practices are, again, keep it simple. Choose the simplest model that you need. If you need to change models, then you can certainly do it. But again, a lot more planning up front is going to remove a lot of pain down the track. So avoid making these big sweeping changes and changing the infrastructure. So think about the model and the progression between the models beforehand. Understand where the identity is mastered on all models. So where do you need to create a new user, change their password? What happens if the internet link is down? Can the user still log in? Where is the actual primary place that the identity of the user is mastered? So the more that you move towards synchronized and federated, the more that moves back to being on-premise. Ensure that you've done all your preparations, so your ID fix. If you need ADFS servers, get them set up, get your certificates, do all that sort of stuff before you go charging down that path. And if you're going down the federated model, make sure that you have redundancy for those servers. So if your internet link goes down, users won't be able to log in. If your ADFS goes down, users typically won't be able to log in. So make sure that you have that redundancy. So our takeaways are cloud identity model is when you've got nothing on premise. That's probably the easiest model, especially for new organizations. Synchronized model is probably your best option. And again, it works well with existing on-prem AD, can be installed on a domain controller. It doesn't require generally any additional equipment to make it work. The federated model is for very specific scenarios. If you really have a third-party app that does need single sign-on or does need some integration, then you may have to look at it, but be aware that it introduces additional complexity. And again, federated identity will require third-party certificates and will need multi-service. So you'll need a guaranteed third-party certificate. And bad thing about certificates is they don't last forever, so they do need renewing. So one of the major pain points or failures that we see out there is that people forget to renew their certificates and update them on the ADFS server, and then nobody can log in. So remember, you not only need multiple servers, but again, third-party certificates. Some resources there for you. Go through and have a look. There's a lot on the net about the different models. The synchronization is pretty straightforward, basically installing the program. But again, just a good idea to move that. Okay, so we're back to poll time. So I appreciate if you could just take a second and answer the poll when I manage to throw it up for you. So if you could just let me know which state your business is in, much appreciated. Helps us categorize the information and know that we're getting across to the audience. So really appreciate you taking a moment to complete that survey. Let us know which state that you are coming from. I'll leave that run for a second. Again, the slides for this event will be available from Dicker directly after, and it will be posted up on the YouTube channel. So once again, thank you for completing that survey. Let's go back to the slides. Okay, so it's now bumped me back to the beginning, so just excuse me while I move to the final slides. Okay, so that should be my poll slide. There we go. And we are now at the end of our webinar, so thank you very much for attending. Here are the Dicker Data contacts. Make sure that if you've got any questions, you can give them a bell, or you send them an email via microsoft.sales@dickerdata.com.au. And our agenda for upcoming webinars is going to be doing some admin of SharePoint Online. Then we'll do some Delve and Office 365 groups. We'll do some troubleshooting. And in October, we'll then dive into doing some basic LAN creation in Azure. So how do you create a basic LAN with a DC and a member server and a few other bits and pieces? What's the best practices around doing that? And as always, if you need to contact me, you can do that via an email, director@ciaops.com. But with that, thank you very much for attending and wish you all the best for the day.